If you open a map of the US and slowly move all the way down to the very edge of the mainland, it becomes clear that Florida isn't just another state. It's a long, narrow peninsula, surrounded by water on three sides. But once you zoom in on the southern part, the familiar picture quickly disappears. Instead of cities and roads, there's a massive, almost continuous stretch of green. This is the Everglades, and right now, a real disaster is unfolding there. This is a huge area, over 2,300 square miles, and one of the largest subtropical wetland systems in North America. There are no proper roads, no clear boundaries, and no real way to control what's happening inside. And it's exactly here that, for years, a situation has been developing that couldn't be stopped by hunting, control programs, or money. We're talking about Burmese pythons, which are no longer rare here. The species has fully established itself and continues to grow, and the consequences of their presence are catastrophic. But the most important part is this: fighting them is basically impossible. The area is too large, and the snakes themselves are extremely hard to spot. They don't make noise, they don't leave obvious traces, and they spend most of their time hidden. But at the same time, they still manage to wipe out everything around them. Traditional control methods no longer work here, and Florida came up with something that, at first glance, sounds completely insane. The story of how Burmese pythons ended up in Florida doesn't start in the wild. It starts with the exotic pet trade. Between the 1970s and the 1990s, demand for unusual pets in the US grew rapidly. Snakes, including large species, were being imported into the country in large numbers. The Burmese python became one of the most popular species. Early in life, they can be kept in captivity without too many problems, and young snakes look harmless, only about 20 to 28 inches long. That's exactly how most people bought them. And then, the problems started. Within just a few years, the snake could grow to several feet long, and keeping it became difficult and expensive. As a result, some owners simply got rid of them. Some released them into the wild. Others lost control, and the snakes escaped. Hurricanes also played a role. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew destroyed a number of facilities in southern Florida that were connected to exotic animal keeping. Private breeders and farms were among those affected. This led to a large number of animals getting into the wild. And then, by the late 1990s, the first stable python populations were already being recorded in the Everglades. At the time, this still wasn't seen as a serious threat. It was believed that such large snakes simply wouldn't be able to establish themselves in a new environment. But the conditions turned out to be perfect. South Florida has a warm, humid climate with mild winters. Temperatures rarely drop below about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which allows the snakes to survive colder periods. On top of that, the region had no natural predators capable of controlling their population, and that's when the slow disaster began. In the first decades, the population grew almost unnoticed. Snakes rarely came into contact with people, and the Everglades are simply too large to monitor consistently. But by the mid-2000s, the situation started to change. Everglades National Park officially confirmed a stable breeding population of Burmese pythons. And by 2010, it became clear that this wasn't about dozens or even hundreds of individuals. It was thousands. What's most interesting is that the exact number is still unknown. Estimates vary, but many experts place the range somewhere between 100,000 and over 300,000 individuals across southern Florida. That's one of the highest densities of large predators for a region like this. The key reason for this boom is their high reproductive rate. A female Burmese python can lay anywhere from 30 to 80 eggs in a single cycle, and in some cases, over 100 eggs have been recorded. Under favorable conditions, a large portion of the offspring survives and then spreads out everywhere. On top of that, these snakes grow quickly. Within just a few years, they reach sizes that allow them to hunt large animals. And unlike many other species, they don't depend on a specific type of prey. That can be anything from a small rodent to a large reptile. And that's what makes them such effective predators. They can adapt to changes in an ecosystem that simply can't handle the pressure. The most noticeable changes started being recorded after 2010. Studies conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey showed a sharp decline in mammal populations in areas where pythons had established themselves. In some cases, it's fair to say that pythons wiped out certain species locally. Raccoon populations dropped by about 99%, opossums by 98%, bobcats by 87%, and in some areas, rabbits disappeared completely. So, Burmese pythons basically eat anything they can catch. At the same time, local animals have no evolutionary experience dealing with a predator like this. For example, raccoons and opossums don't recognize a snake as a threat from a distance, which lowers their chances of survival. As a result, pythons had access to a large amount of prey in the early stages of their spread. But okay, at first, they wiped out everything smaller than themselves. What happened next? Next, they started expanding their menu. As the population kept growing, cases started to appear that were once considered unlikely. In particular, pythons began hunting animals that are predators themselves. There are documented cases of them eating both alligators and deer, and that's not something minor. One of the most well-known incidents happened in 2005, when a python was found in the Everglades that had been torn open from the inside by an alligator it was trying to swallow. This showed that the snakes are now directly interacting with the top of the local food chain. Predators are no longer a real barrier for them, and that says a lot. So at this point, pythons stopped being just an invasive species. They started costing authorities a huge amount of money. One of the key issues here is the loss of white-tailed deer. This is a core species for the hunting industry in the U.S. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, deer hunting generates tens of billions of dollars every year nationwide through licenses, equipment, tourism, and related spending. Florida is part of that system as well, especially in the northern and central parts of the state. But in the southern part, including areas around the Everglades, things are changing. Studies have shown that after pythons spread, deer populations dropped in certain areas. This isn't a uniform decline across the entire state. These are localized collapses tied to high snake density. The problem is that an adult python is fully capable of hunting deer and doing it effectively. There are documented cases where snakes over 13 feet long successfully consumed adult deer. That means the pressure isn't just on small animals. It's hitting a key resource for the hunting economy. At the same time, direct costs of controlling the python population are rising. Florida currently runs the Python Action Program, where participants are paid to capture snakes. The base pay is around $13 to $18 per hour, with additional payments for each snake. Larger individuals bring higher payouts. Since these programs were launched, millions of dollars have already been spent. Every year, thousands of snakes are removed, but the overall population remains high. And that doesn't even include the cost of research and technology. Things like radio tracking, area monitoring, and developing new detection methods. On top of that, there's the work of biologists, patrol operations, and data processing. All of this requires funding that isn't going down, it's increasing. There are also indirect losses. For example, the decline in small mammal populations affects the region's appeal to tourists. The Everglades aren't just wetlands. They're a place people come to observe wildlife. When animals disappear, fewer visitors come. On top of that, reports from residents are increasing. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission receives hundreds of reports every year about encounters with large snakes. Each report requires a response, dispatching teams, inspections, sometimes removal. But even at this scale, the result is limited. When the population is in the hundreds of thousands, removing a few thousand snakes a year doesn't have a meaningful impact. And that's because Burmese pythons have certain traits that allow them to spread and take over territory. The main problem is the environment they live in. The Everglades are a complex system of wetlands, canals, and dense vegetation. Visibility is often limited to just a few yards. Movement is difficult, and access to many areas is only possible by water. Water depth in many areas ranges from about 4 to 20 inches, but it can change rapidly after rainfall. During the wet season, water levels rise, and areas that were previously accessible become impossible to reach. In the dry season, new areas open up, but animal distribution shifts. Moving through these conditions requires either specialized flat-bottom boats or long walks through water and mud. This severely limits search speed, and not everyone is willing to do this kind of work. And pythons take full advantage of that. The Burmese python has a coloration that almost perfectly blends into the environment. Brown and olive patterns match dry grass, mud, and water. In the Everglades, that means you might not notice a snake even if it's right under your feet. But it's not just camouflage. These snakes spend most of their time completely still. They can lie in ambush for hours, sometimes even days, without making noticeable movements. They also spend a large portion of their time in or underwater. They can hold their breath for up to 30 minutes and use that to move undetected. In murky water, spotting them is almost impossible. Even thermal imaging has limitations. The ambient temperature in Florida is often close to the snake's body temperature, especially during warmer periods. That reduces contrast and makes detection harder. As a result, even experienced specialists can walk right past a snake and not see it. And yes, their high reproductive rate offsets all losses. Even with active removal, the population recovers. So, this is what you end up with. The area is too large, the snakes are too hard to spot, and control methods are limited. At this point, it becomes clear that standard approaches aren't enough. Something else is needed, and Florida has an option. If typical tools like trackers and thermal cameras don't work well, then the solution has to be something that attracts the snakes. Something that mimics prey closely enough that the snake can't ignore it and comes in as close as possible. This is where robotic bait comes in. These are devices that imitate small mammals, primarily rabbits, both in appearance and behavior. And that choice isn't random. Historically, rabbits were one of the main prey species in the region, and their disappearance is directly linked to the spread of pythons. These devices are being developed as part of research programs and tested in environments close to natural conditions. The goal is to create something the snake reacts to as if it were real prey. To do that, several elements are used: irregular movement with pauses, a shape similar to a real animal, and heat output, as if the device has body temperature. In some prototypes, chemical markers are also added to imitate scent. These devices are placed in areas where snake activity has been recorded, transition zones between water and land, animal trails, and vegetation edges. To understand why this should work, you need to look at how a Burmese python identifies prey. The snake relies on a combination of signals, and one of the key ones is infrared radiation, body heat. When the bait reproduces that signal, the snake sees it as a potential target. It may approach, take position, and attempt to strike. That's the moment when there's a chance to capture the python, or at least confirm its presence. Because the main goal here is contact. Under normal conditions, a snake can move just a few yards away and remain completely unnoticed. Here, it actively engages. And that's critical, because it allows researchers to identify active zones, track movement, and estimate population density. In an environment where direct observation is difficult, this becomes a real advantage, and that's exactly what they started using. In July 2025, the South Florida Water Management District, together with researchers from the University of Florida, launched an experimental program using robotic bait. As mentioned earlier, these devices were designed to imitate marsh rabbits, one of the prey species pythons historically targeted. In terms of scale, about 120 robotic rabbits were deployed across different parts of the Everglades. The devices were powered by solar panels and could be controlled remotely. Even during testing, there were recorded cases where snakes reacted to the bait and approached it. However, it's still too early to talk about any breakthrough. There's no data showing a reduction in the overall population, so the results are considered preliminary. But in practice, this is the first time python control in Florida has shifted from direct killing to attempting to influence predator behavior. The very fact that these technologies are being developed shows the main point. Traditional methods are no longer enough. Now the goal is no longer full elimination, but finding new ways to deal with the problem inside an environment that can no longer be fully controlled. And yes, the system still needs improvement, because these snakes are not simple animals. Pythons aren't purely reflex-driven reptiles. They can adjust their behavior based on experience. If the bait isn't edible, their response can weaken. In some cases, snakes approach the object but don't attack, or they strike once and then ignore similar signals after that. On top of that, conditions in the Everglades create additional challenges. High humidity affects electronics, dense vegetation limits how devices can move, and water changes how heat spreads. All of this reduces how effective the bait is, and means it has to be constantly refined. There's also the issue of scale. To cover a meaningful area, you need a large number of devices. That drives up costs and makes maintenance more complicated. And just to give you an idea, one of these robotic rabbits costs around $4,000, which is not cheap. Despite these limitations, development is still ongoing. The current control system already includes multiple layers: radio tracking, manual capture and hunting after a snake is detected, cameras and motion sensors, and finally, robotic bait. Each method only works partially on its own, but together they form a monitoring network. The problem is that this network has to keep expanding. The Everglades aren't static. Water levels change, animals move, vegetation grows. That means equipment has to be relocated, areas have to be checked again, and systems have to be updated. As a result, control turns into a continuous process. There's no point where you can stop and say, the problem is solved. At this point, fully eliminating this invasive species is no longer considered realistic. And that's the hard part. Burmese pythons are too deeply established in the ecosystem. They've taken over a niche, changed feeding patterns, and affected the populations of other species. Even with active intervention, their population remains stable. All the methods being used, from hunting to technological solutions, function as containment tools, but they don't bring the system back to its original state. What you end up with is a new reality. This isn't a fight that ends. It's ongoing management of a process that has already started and continues to evolve.